This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. My guest today is an associate professor of history at Brooklyn College, City University of New York, specializing in the modern history of Israel, Palestine, and Turkey. His book, Jews and Palestinians in the Late Ottoman Era, 1908 to 1914, Claiming the Homeland, was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2020. Louis Fishman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So the period your book covers is bookended by two major events in the very final history of the Ottoman Empire: the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 and the start of the First World War that brought about the empire's demise. Why were these events so crucial in the history of Palestine?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think first of all, I think even if we went back farther, if I would have, when you start your work, you think that your area is going to be something special. To tell the truth, I think overall, what the conclusion of my book will come to is that there are a lot of unstudied parts of Palestine, and we need to rethink how we study it to begin with. So that we can talk about in a few minutes. But I'll go ahead and say
you preempted my next question.
Yeah, exactly. but I'll tell you what the important thing about 1908, 1914 is that there were during the Young Turk Revolution, people within the empire, both citizens and non-citizens within the empire, that I'm speaking of Jews, and others also, started to reimagine the empire in a new way. And what we see is that they believe that it's going to continue on for a generation or generations more. They don't see that it's going to come to abrupt end, especially in 1917, Palestine with the British occupation that started in Jerusalem in December 1917 and ended by the fall of 1918, right? So it took them about 6 to 9 months to really occupy Palestine to begin with. So if we look at this period, it's especially interesting to see once again how both the Jewish community starts reimagining themselves as Ottoman citizens, and the Palestinians actually see that Jews are able to attain some kind of autonomy, and this is worrying to them. And Palestinians actually, where Jews really couldn't foresee this idea of an independent state, Palestinians actually started to understand that Jews were actually making claim over the homeland, and that they too would need to make claim over the homeland. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, I think this really, if you read the book, and you read the book obviously, I think there's so much in it that we've never really talked about in the history of Palestine, whether it's the Jewish Yishuv, whether it's Arab history also. So I think that's very, very exciting. Is that point where citizens of the empire really start to see themselves as becoming active citizens, and that really changes the whole picture.
And how is this related to the Young Turk Revolution? What is it about that revolution itself that allowed created the conditions for that change?
So the Young Turk Revolution, for the Zionist Young Turk Revolution, I think was very important because this was a group of young Ottoman officers and civilians who also wanted to modernize the empire and wanted to bring it to a new level of democracy, of Ottoman democracy, of representation across the board, and also bringing in the non-Muslims as giving them a voice as full citizens. And they, oddly enough, the Young Turks find Armenian support, Greek support, and Jewish support. And for that support, why were they interested in giving them support? The idea was enabled to integrate. First, you had to integrate into the empire in order to separate with autonomy. So first of all, they said, okay, if you're going to be full citizens and you're going to join the army, well, you know what? The young Ottomans in Istanbul, the Muslim elite, is saying, we're happy to give you some sort of autonomy. Now, we know how this ends. It ends in disaster. It ends with the Armenian genocide in 1915. It ends with the Greek-Turkish exchange. Of course, other Christians were massacred during this period of time. If we look at the Balkan Wars, it ends with mass expulsions of Muslims from the Balkans, right? So we really have a period where this upheaval starts, where that ethnic nationalism really takes hold. And that includes Jewish communities also. But the Jewish community itself holds on to the idea of Ottoman state all the way through 1914. And it's only around 1915, 1916, it's people like Vladimir Jabotinsky already early on could understand that, wait, our future's not with Ottomans.
I was just going to say, because for the Jews, it actually did not end in a disaster. It ended with great elation, right? So
exactly.
So how is it? How did that abrupt change when the British came in? How did that recreate the whole, political imagination of the Jews?
I mean, if we jump up to 1917, that is the major breaking point. And that really is, my book argues that you can trace the conflict back to this period. But we never, what I always talk about is that we read Israeli history backwards, right? And to the great extent, Palestinian history is written within a mirror image of the Jewish history, Zionist history. So that really 1917 is the breaking point. Had the Ottomans won the war, well, we don't do that in history, right? We could play around what would have happened. But let's get back for a second to 1908, Young Turk Revolution. And remember that the Zionist movement at this moment seizes this revolution to open up a newspaper network in Istanbul. The Ottoman Jewish community, a very, very good part of it, become Zionist also. And it's within this period where Zionism transforms into a cultural movement. If you're in Palestine, what they call the Jewish Yishuv, then this is by adopting Hebrew as your mother tongue, connecting Sfaradim, the Sephardic Jewish community, the Ashkenazi community, the secular community, and the religious communities. It really unites them together. But for people in Istanbul, for example, Jews in Istanbul, for many of them, this was having Hebrew as a spoken tongue, learning it in kindergartens, but then adopting Turkish. So we see that this in Beirut, you have, for example, suddenly clubs open up and they say, one of the documents I read, I think it's my book, maybe in a footnote, but they say, let's have a Hebrew play in the middle of Beirut. They put up signs in Hebrew around the city, and people have to read the Hebrew to get there. People don't know Hebrew, and not in Istanbul, and not in Beirut for the most part. They could read Hebrew. Many people in Istanbul could read Hebrew. But this idea, once again, as a cultural movement is very big. And it's during this period that anti-Semitism also takes hold in the empire. And what's funny here is that we see already then, we have this confusion between Zionism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism. So my book argues is that the Palestinians weren't at all anti-Semitic. They were literally worried that Jews were becoming a stronger community, that they see that they have other aims and they're losing their hold over a lot of the different realms within Palestine.
But was Zionism anything to be reckoned with before the Balfour Declaration, before the British were there to endorse and give all the structural and infrastructural support to Zionism?
For the Palestinians, it was, most definitely. For Palestinians, you see from 1910 or 1911, what we have with Palestinians, and I think this should be clear that in my work calendar is a lot of new work that talks about the Arab Jews. I've done another paper since then that talk about Arab Jews and were closer to the Arab population. This is true in Baghdad. This is true in Cairo. There was a really huge divide in Palestine, though, and that was over adopting Hebrew. So the Palestinians, who are the Muslims and the Christians, on one hand, you have the Muslim politicians, from the three prestigious families, the Khalidi family and the Al Husseini and the Nashashibi, where you see that they're also in the Ottoman parliament. Remember, the representatives from Jerusalem are in the Ottoman parliament, and they bring the Zionist debate to the parliament, the Palestinian community. But on the other hand, you have the Christian editors that are writing for newspapers like Philistine, El Carmel, Haifa, and El Quds and Jerusalem. So what we see is that you have this merging together of them understanding on one hand that, wait a minute, Zionists are able to buy land despite that it's illegal for them to buy the land. They're able to get this land through different deals, and there's different ways that they're able to do this. And that's when you have the two merging together to adopt the peasant cause. And that really doesn't include at all the Jewish community. I mean, the Arabic-speaking Jewish community. In fact, the Arabic-speaking Jewish community in Palestine was very, very small in terms of those who can read and write, right? Most of them could. So by 1910, the newspaper HaCherut, they first started saying, let's write Judeo-Arabic. They said, no, let's do it in Hebrew. And they actually say that there's only a few people that can actually read and write in Arabic. Although they can read the Hebrew, they can read the Hebrew, and that's when you have this separation between the two.
It sounds a lot like a parallel iteration, maybe a later one, of the Haskalah, of the Jewish Enlightenment in Europe. Is it like the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I think that if we look at once again the Jewish history, I think we're going to have to break down this whole idea of the first and second Aliyah. You have already in the 1850s and 1860s a large immigration of Jews to Palestine. You have a very large group that I want to explore more of, North African Jews reaching Palestine. And many of them, sometimes like Nissim Malul, one of the people I work on, his family had came a couple hundred years before that and lived in Safed, for example. Then you have Shimon Moel, you have different people that are Arabic-speaking Jews, but they're just as much part of that, the Haskalah, of that adopting Hebrew as a modern language. Now remember, we have this myth that Eliezer ben Yehuda completely started Hebrew from scratch and modernized Hebrew. If you go to Ben Yehuda's newspaper, Hatzvi, it's actually much harder to read than the Sephardic newspaper because he's trying to revive biblical Hebrew. So his place is written down in history already in that period as someone that wanted to bring Hebrew as a spoken language. And that was his contribution. But already, when we look at in Istanbul 1912 and 13, people from the Jewish Yeshuv like Gad Frumkin, his brother-in-law Karmi Eisenberg, the son of Aaron Eisenberg in Rehovot, Aaron Eisenberg's daughter, Sada, who marries Gad Frumkin and goes to Istanbul. They're all writing in Hebrew by this point. Everything, in fact, almost all my documents from people from Palestine, including Ben Gurion, who came in 1905, much later, and then ended up in Istanbul, right? He's writing in Hebrew. That's his language. He's writing fluent Hebrew, and all the newspapers are in Hebrew. And some of these are papers that I'm getting stuff from are from Poland and in Russia also.
Because these people were the products of the Haskalah in Europe before?
Exactly. They were the product of the Haskalah, and they really were brought up on reading and writing Hebrew. So this idea, once you get to that, once you delve into the newspapers, you see a very, very different Jewish yeshuv. So let me get back real fast. So that narrative of the first and second Aliyah really doesn't work. And what I'm claiming, and hopefully I'll develop in the next couple of years, is that David Ben Gurion and the leaders of the Labor Party, who become the hegemonic power in the 1930s and 40s, later they're known for discriminating and marginalizing the Mizrahim community, the community of Arabic-speaking Jews in the 1950s and 60s. But the mistake here is that a lot of historians said, this group was marginalized already in the Young Turk era. And I say, no, not at all. It's not that they were marginalized. They were central characters that have been written out of the history, meaning they're marginalized by the Labor Party history, which puts the second Aliyah, the immigrants from 1905 to up to 1914, or 1904 to up to 1914, puts them as the sort of stars of the Zionist narrative.
Because they were in many ways the founding fathers of the labor movement.
Exactly. And they de facto become, in quotation, the founding fathers of the Jewish state of Israel, right? They become the first leaders. So whether we have Moshe Sharet or Ben Gurion, Yitzhak Ben Zvi, we all, I'll give you an example. And you saw in the book, I actually don't talk too much about Ben Gurion because he really wasn't a central figure then at all. But he was in Istanbul. And I always argue that if Zionist history had placed a stronger emphasis on him being in Istanbul, that breaks the smooth narrative of Zionism. What was Ben Gurion doing in Istanbul? Why was he opening up the Hebrew Students Union, the Union of Hebrew Speakers in Istanbul, Hebrew students in Istanbul? Because he didn't believe that the empire was going to fall. And because they were all studying law because they might become lawyers so they could run for parliament one day, right? So the minute we start exploring that option, then we say, wait a minute, but what about the Hashomer, the guardsmen, and what about the first kvutza, the first kibbutzes and stuff like that are propped up as models. So we have to actually write out that history in order to create that smooth narrative. And when you write that history, when you write them out, you also write out the very central figures of the Yeshuv that weren't part of the first and second Aliyah. These were the Sephardic Arabic-speaking Jews.
I will come back to that shortly, but I just want to discuss another historical axiom or perhaps dichotomy that your book sort of dispels, and that is not so much about like the counter aspect, but more about the political aspect. And that is, according to conventional wisdom, there's a dichotomy between the old Yeshuv and the new Yeshuv, right? The Zionist newcomers who were very political and, of course, Zionistic, and the old Yeshuv that was less political, maybe less subscribing to Zionism. And also the picture that you paint is a lot more intricate than that.
Absolutely, because the old Yeshuv, or both the old Yeshuv and the first Aliyah, they've almost been seen as apolitical, and I say no, it's just the politics were very, very different. The politics were Ottoman politics. The politics were trying to lobby the government, and it's their children that start joining the Ottoman army, right? Out of a belief of, after the Young Turk Revolution, let's look at Karmi Eisenberg, who I bring in. And I've been finding more and more, now that the Ottoman newspapers have a search engine that's much easier to find keywords, I'm finding more about, I found an article in Ottoman Turkish in one of the main newspapers in Istanbul talking about 3 Russian citizens joining the army. They're Zionist Jews from Palestine. The government saying, who are these people? Why are they joining our army? They're joining out of patriotism. And there's a lot of, overall, I would say in Istanbul, if you want to come to say in a really short and a sweet way, there's a lot of confusion over Zionism. We can come back to that because they say, wait a minute, they're joining our army. Now, if you go back to someone like Karmi Eisenberg, though, Karmi Eisenberg is born in what is Rehovot. He's raised there. He's around 16, 17. You have the Young Turk Revolution, and he starts itching for excitement. Palestine's a small place. It's I don't want to say the backwaters of the empire, but it's very far from the empire. Jerusalem is almost like a neighborhood of Istanbul in a way. Also, and the connections between the two is very important. And I'm seeing that Cairo also had very strong connections with Jerusalem, but it's not a major city like Baghdad or Damascus or even Beirut at this moment. It's a bit isolated here. So Karmi Eisenberg says, you know what? I want to go to Istanbul and I want to join the farming school, the agricultural school. I think this would just sort of cover to let his father agree. His brother-in-law and his sister are there in Istanbul, where they're opening up a Ottoman society to buy land in Palestine. That's exactly what, together with their own Eisenberg, Netaim. Okay, so Karmi ends up there, and he's not satisfied with the agricultural school. He joins the military school, and he becomes the first Hebrew-speaking proud Ottoman officer, right? He's one of the few Jewish officers in the Ottoman army, and he fights in the Balkan Wars, and he gets the title Ghazi, which is, Later on it's used sometimes. It's sort of like a prestigious name for someone that has, fought in wars, endangered their life. And he becomes Ghazi Karmi Effendi. Okay. During World War I, he goes to fight. He falls POW on the Eastern Front, ends up in Siberia in a prison, where before the exchange happens after the war, he dies, I forget of which disease, a sickness, but he was teaching Hebrew to other people within that camp. He's later memorialized in modern Turkey for dying as like a shaheed, and he's memorialized also in the canals of Israel, right? Sort of what do you call it? The IDF memorial, right? You see Karmi Eisenberg's name. So he's memorialized both by Turkey and both by Israel. And later on, we could talk about the connection between those two. So once you see that these people are fighting, you know that they're memorialized within the history. But once again, we did very little with them, right? And Karmi is someone, I think, and we're finding more and more soldiers that were joining the army. And this is before that 1914 period where they said you have to join the army, you have to become Ottoman citizens, or you could be expelled, and some were expelled during the war, right? So this is before. No one's pressuring to do this. But that's I like to look at Karmi once again when we talk about reimagining, because he really believes that the future is with the Ottomans. And if we look at plans by Gad Frumkin, now remember in 1909 or 1909, the end of 1909 at the Zionist Congress, the Zionists are also saying we're forfeiting the idea of an independent state. We want to integrate within the Ottoman system. And once you start understanding that, you start understanding how is it possible that in 1912, an Ottoman governor, this is a new work I'm doing. I mentioned at the very beginning of the book, but I never really developed it. An Ottoman governor goes to Petah Tikva with the mayor, al-Husseini mayor of Jerusalem, together with the Zionist representative, Arthur Rupin, together with, later on, I believe, the Ottoman parliamentarian, Ruhi al-Khalidi also came. And they visited the Jewish yeshuv. And the Palestinians start saying, okay, this is cool, but they have their own flag. They have their own guardsmen. And the Ottoman governor says, no, you have to integrate your yeshuv, your settlement, your farming community within the Ottoman system. And that's really what the debate is about already in 1911, is that the fear by the Palestinians that they're becoming really an independent community. Now, you ask, why is that a threat? You had asked that before. That's a great question, because this is exactly what the Ottomans are saying. The Ottoman elite. Now, remember, we talked about a second about the anti-Zionist movement, which is really based in anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories in Istanbul. But the Ottomans overall say, are we afraid of this small Jewish community that maybe reaches about 100,000 people, that they're expressing loyalty to the Ottoman Empire? Who are these? Who is this small group of Jews to challenge our great empire? So that's sort of where they're coming. They're coming and saying that, no, they're not a threat whatsoever. Palestinians see it differently. Now, why is it a threat? You have one, I talk about for the first time, is that Palestinians are leaving in large numbers. They're going to South America and North America. There's a general trend of mass migration from the area of Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, even southern Turkey. Okay, this is both Christians and Muslims. People thought there was Christians, also Christians and Muslims. People are leaving slowly the villages. Zionists are starting to buy land, and this is creating a landless peasant class for the first time. And once they start moving away from their homes, suddenly what's the importance of these middlemen, the muhtar, the village leaders? If they don't have land and they don't have people under them, and they're connected to the urban notables also. So the whole Palestinian front is being shaken up slowly. And by 1912 and 13, they really see it as a threat. And this is where we come to the 1914 period. And by 1914, they say we are now seeing that we're losing our homeland. And that's really where you see that this is going to conflict. Let me add that the Jewish community, like they lobby in Britain later on, like they lobby in the U.S. later on, right, in much later on, starting with, I would say, the Biltmore Conference. But even between 20s and 30s, you have Jewish lobbying in the United States with the Democrat and Republican Party. They're lobbying in Istanbul. They have a newspaper network in Istanbul, and the Palestinians know this also. So for them, that is a moment they're saying like, and let's add to that a higher death rate, infant mortality rate. So if you put all those statistics together, for the Palestinians, they see that their land is under threat, and they start exaggerating the numbers later on. And this is interesting. Yeah. And I look at petitions, I look at the petitions, I look at different things like that.
So it's a time of great social and political upheaval. Also a very short period of time, in less than a decade.
Yeah, literally it's 6 years.
Yeah. So there's a lot of hopes that are dashed, a lot of fears that some of them are materialized, some are not. Can you tell us about the changing mood of some of these leaders, intellectuals, both Jewish and Palestinians, when they realized that the tides are changing, or maybe some of them had like a premonition saying, okay, this empire, the sick man of Europe, maybe they didn't know it was called that, but maybe they had a feeling all sorts that it wasn't, that the empire would not last forever.
Yeah, we have to remember that the negative part of Abdul Hamid is that he was an authoritarian leader that limited their freedoms. The strong part that was he strengthened the empire quite a bit. And by 1908, they feel much more, I think, stable. Now, if you look at the two parliamentarians, I look at Ruhi al-Khalidi and Said al-Husseini, they're interesting people because they know the Jewish community very well. I think both had briefly been in alliance. I think Ruhi al-Khalidi knew Hebrew basically, or could. They were Freemasons together with other Jewish Jews, who some of them were Zionist. From Jonathan Gribbett's book, we know that Ruhi al-Khalidi and Eliezer ben Yehuda used to meet regularly and have discussions and stuff like that. So you see these people, you see this this changing tide through them, where they're on one hand very open, and then when they start seeing that they're bringing this to the parliament, saying, yes, we have a problem. For Palestinians, this is a problem, and this is a threat. We start seeing that they really hit a wall. And their problem is that they're part of the Committee of Union Progress. The ones that are behind the Young Turk Revolution is called the Committee of Union Progress, CUP. And these are the modernizers. These are the ones that are leaning towards more sympathetic to Zionism or sympathetic to Jewish cultural autonomy. And the conspiracy theories in Istanbul are anti-Freemasons. Conspiracy theories in Istanbul are parliamentarians that say basically the CUP was taken over by a group of Jews in Salonika, and the Jews are behind the revolution. We know that there was the British ambassador that had put forth this idea. But if we look at it overall, I'm not sure if he created it or he heard it there. He heard it there also. No one's ever mentioned that, by the way. They said, it was spread by him. But it's pretty strong by then. So what the irony is that the Palestinians are actually on the opposing side of the anti-Zionist, who believe that it was Freemasons and Zionists, and this other group of Sabbatean Jews, the followers of Shabtai Tzvi, the ones that had converted to Islam, kept Judaism secret, and stuff like this group from Thessaloniki. So it is this idea of this conspiracy theory, this hidden enemy of Jews. And ironically, the Palestinian parliamentarians are with that group. So they have a really hard time convincing their own group that these Jews are going to be any threat. Now, let me real fast at the same time mention, because we haven't talked about it, is that I argue at this time that Palestinians for the first time start identifying also as Palestinians. And this is not only because Zionism was a big part of it. It was because of Zionism that we start seeing, or Zionism, British imperialism, I would say, and we can look at the Haram al-Sharif incident, archaeological dig. So the Palestinians started seeing themselves as the protectorates of Jerusalem, basically, and of the land itself. And this is very clear. You start seeing words like Ashab Falastini, the Palestinian people. Now, it goes in the face of all the claims and that you'll hear historians very pro, sometimes Israel, over the overflowing support for this idea that there was never a Palestinian people, right? That was very expressed in Palestinian nationalism arose in the 1960s. Before that, there really was nothing. They were all Arabs. They were all Syrian Arabs. What I see is that they weren't all Syrian Arabs. And you see this very clear dichotomy between Syria and Palestine. And because of that, we start seeing words like, this kind of local patriotism, where we talk about hub al-watan, the love of the land, and the love of the homeland, basically, of the Ummah Palestiniya.
But did any of this grow in a specifically Ottoman context? Because you did mention Zionism, you did mention British imperialism, and all.
Yeah, so that's really what. Thanks for stressing that point. Yes, remember, this is a local patriotism. The Palestinians never, ever can imagine their world without that Ottoman world. They're part of that Ottoman world. They can't imagine themselves as some kind of independent country. But I argue the Zionists were the same way in that sense. Right?
I want to go back to...
That's why it's interesting, right?
And going back to my previous question, so when things start going down the drain, how do they react? How does it, in what situation does it?
So how do Palestinians react? They react, first of all, in petitions. You have numerous petitions, whether it's from the Fula land cells, peasants writing, saying, we're frustrated. This is our land from time immemorial. We've been here. We're being thrown off our land, and this is our land. Of course, Beiruti landowners had bought it during the 1860s, during the reforms, when the Ottomans actually came to the peasants and said, "Do you want to buy this land? We want you to register it." And the peasants are very suspicious to register their names for army reasons, taxes. And these Beiruti landowners come and buy it, and they have the right to sell it. Zionists buy it through middlemen, often Jewish, Ottoman Jews, and suddenly they get evicted. They start getting evicted from their land. So that's one. You have petitions. You have petitions from Jerusalem. You have petitions from Gaza. You have petitions from all over Palestine saying, you know what, this is becoming a problem. But it's only around, I would say, 1913, 1914 when you see this. Now, at the same time, you have the press, and the press is very, very strongly worded that they are worried that Palestine is going to be lost.
Right.
And a lot of people like
the Arab press.
The Arab press. And a lot of people said, they're anti-Semitic. They're Christians, they're anti-Semitic. Muslims don't have a problem with us.
What about the Jews? The last whimpers of the Ottoman Empire, did it come as bad news for them or not necessarily?
Listen, the Jewish press during this period is looking at the Palestinian press and saying this is flat out anti-Semitism. And this is regardless if they're Zionists or not Zionists. There's no really big difference between a Zionist newspaper and a non-Zionist newspaper. You look at Moria or you look at Tzvi, you look at Hachirut, there's really no big difference. And that's why I'm hoping that we can, from this, at least this period, sort of stop calling people Zionist and that. Because Zionism, for many of them, it was an idea that they never had to adopt. But they just it became internalized into their daily life, and that's through Hebrew, right? So I think that if we look at that, we'll see. So their newspapers are very, very active. They're very active, and if you go back to the newspapers, active in saying, these Palestinians, these are anti-Semitic articles, and they're able to lobby the chief rabbi, who is the anti-Zionist himself, to shut down the newspapers. So it's the Sephardic Jews that see that they talk about you have the kibush ha'adama, right? The occupation of the land. You have or the liberating of the land, right? You have one of the job market, which is already beginning. People don't like this second aliyah, labor, Jewish only practice. But the Sephardic Jews are saying, we're going to start kibush itonut. we're going to start the occupation or taking responsibility to take over the press. And they are adamant that the Palestinians are anti-Semitic because they also live part-time in Cairo, many of them, and they're saying, well, we're accepted there, so why aren't we accepted here? We're accepted in Baghdad, so why aren't we accepted here? So a lot of them, so what we're getting at this time, I think it's a confused picture. But on the other hand, if you just delve into the newspapers once again, you see that they really are in the Ottoman world. So the Jewish community is a small community, and they see themselves really connected to Istanbul. I'll give you another example. A guy named Avraham El-Maliach. I've worked more later on after the book. And, he is writing for Eliezer Ben Yehuda's paper, Hatzvi, who felt betrayed when he went to the Hachirut, the Sephardic newspaper. Then the chief rabbi, Chaim Nachum, who's an anti-Zionist, I put in quotations, he's for Jewish immigration. He's not a Zionist, though. He's for the Hebrew Yeshuv. He's not for independent. He's the chief rabbi of the Ottomans. So El-Maliach goes with him to Istanbul and starts teaching Hebrew there. Later, he comes to Damascus, becomes a Hebrew teacher in Damascus. He says, not like in Palestine, these people don't even know Hebrew. They don't even know Hebrew, so we should Hebrewize them. And he's on the editorial board of the paper of Poale Zion, of the labor Zionists also. And then by 1914, right before the war, he's opening up Maccabi sports team in Jaffa, which is very, very pro-Zionist. Already in Istanbul, they were very active, the Maccabi teams. And then he's going to work for the Zionist bank in Gaza, but the war breaks out. So we see how a local Jew who's raised of North African background has been completely forgotten. Now, a lot of people looked at him as offering a different type of Zionism, and I say, no, actually not. He's mainstream Zionism at this point. But once you delve into these papers, you start finding numerous stories like this. More so than any history book you've ever read, even a percent of what's happening there.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe it will be our last question. We'll see. And it's a counterfactual one, which I know you historians hate normally.
Oh, obviously. Yes, of course.
But, trying to, you keep writing and saying that, both, especially the Jews, but also the Arabs, imagined the Ottoman Empire as something else and something that would be long-lasting. And if it had lasted longer than it did, that very brief period of time, that, as we said, was full of social and political upheaval, but had they lasted a bit longer, do you think both Jews and Arabs, maybe Palestine in general, would have been better off? Would it prosper?
Listen, it's a really hard question to pose. We know that in 1914, for the first time, Jews and Arabs are starting to meet to talk about how they're going to deal with the war, and they meet in Jerusalem. And it's very interesting because some of the Sephardic Jews that speak Arabic say, well, this is the first time we really met up with them. And leading them was Ben Yehuda, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, the Ashkenazi Jew that from the first Aliyah that transformed Hebrew. So he was he was big on his own accord for other reasons. Once again, for other reasons that we don't learn about. We learn about something, I say we, I'll take that back, you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I never heard when I was a kid growing up in this. But on the other hand, by 1914, you see that the Palestinians reach a stage of desperation. And this is clear. Every newspaper, and it's becoming more and more even nationalistic in tone. So I think, regardless of what was going to happen, we see that they were on track for a conflict. And it would be hard to imagine the Ottomans would have been able to manage this because the Ottomans themselves had so many different problems during this period. But definitely, if you look at one of the projects of the Zionist movement that's being developed is that they were talking about maybe mass migration of Jews to Istanbul that could, over 20 or 30 years, they could be raised as proud Ottomans and convince Ottomans to give Jews autonomy in 20 or 30 years from that day. This is 1914. The Zionist organization doesn't adopt this plan.
So it would be like an Ottoman Balfour Declaration.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So when you look at that, it's pretty clear that that both Jews and Arabs couldn't foresee this, but Arabs also had a keen understanding. I think that the Jewish community was going in a way that was against their interest.
Yeah.
And that was very early on. And let me end by saying that's very surprising, because they believed more in this idea that the Jews would be able to succeed in reaching some kind of at least autonomy there, right?
Yeah.
More than the Jews themselves. While the Jewish community also says, at the same time, they say, look at the Arab, the Palestinians, of course, are part of the Arab nation also. And they are working vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire, trying to receive Arabic rights for Arabic, different things like that. The Jewish community says, look how the Arabs are working. We need to use them as a model. And this is very funny, because we always hear that Arabs learned nationalism from Jews. No, it's opposite. In this case, you have quite a few articles saying, look at the Arabs, look how they're working vis-a-vis the Ottoman administration. Let's take that as a model.
Yeah.
And that really changes our understanding completely of what we know today.
Well, this is really just the tip of the iceberg, and there's plenty more of that in your book, Professor Louis Fishman, and in your book called Jews and Palestinians in the Late Ottoman Jews and Palestinians in the Late Ottoman Era, 1918 to 1914. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
And also many thanks to Itai Shalom, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, whatever. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 750 interviews, all free to download. Please like us on Facebook, like me on Twitter, and the podcast as well. And do not forget to join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.